Hey there, I'm Bella, and I want you to come with me on a journey for my first official VTuber model commission. I've made a few models in the past, but they've purely been for personal use, and nowadays I've been mainly working on VTuber assets like throwable models, so this was so exciting to work on. And honestly, it's only recently hit me that, oh my gosh, someone is out there using the model that I made. I'm a VTuber mama now. And so I'll have all of their details down below. They're really sweet and their debut has already happened, but I didn't want to show off their entire model before the debut, and so that's why this video is coming out after. As always, this isn't a tutorial, barely even a walkthrough, but more of just, this is how I made this model, here's what I did, some tips and tricks along the way. So hopefully it helps in some capacity, but I won't be going too much into detail. I'm also not an expert and I'm still learning things all the time and improving. I'm also not really good at explaining things and I'm not a teacher, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you may have if you leave them in the comments below. Or another option, I also work on these live sometimes on Twitch if you want to come in and get like live feedback, live questions, that kind of thing. Anyway, on to the process. They already had a reference sheet for their character, and so they wanted the model to be in that style rather than the more anime style model traditional VTuber look. So I pulled the body from my Space Galaxy cat model to use as a base, because that seemed like the perfect place to start, and I got to work pushing and pulling it, modifying the proportions to match this character better. Which is very different from my model, so it was a lot of finagling and back and forth, but it was a fun challenge to match what they had already given me. I mainly just used proportional editing in edit mode to push the body to where it needed to be, and then I finished it off with a little bit of sculpting to smooth it out and get rid of any awkward shaped bits. Here, a helpful tip that I always like to give is, especially helpful when using proportional editing, is to hide loops or parts of the mesh to act as kind of like a mask that aren't affected by your edits. It's super helpful to really zone in and just affect certain parts, like of the face, while keeping all the other parts that are already in a good shape unaffected. Their character is a shapeshifter, however, they still keep some cat-like elements like the ears and the feet, so their feet are a little bit different to humans. I started on making them some new feet from scratch, but since they're going to be covered by shoes all the time, this was just going to be a waste of time and I just skipped over it. With the face, you might notice that the cheeks look all spiky and wonky on certain angles, and that's because the mesh is made out of quads. And when you have a quad, like how I like to picture it, is to take a single piece of paper, and if one corner of that paper bends, like if you're holding two diagonal corners and one of the other corner bends, there has to be a crease or a fold between two of the corners to physically make that shape happen. And so, for example, the quads that make up the cheeks on the face, they aren't perfectly flat because they are curving to form that cheek shape. And to help them render them nicely, I go and make cuts between two of the corners, which turns them into triangles, and it just looks nice and smooth. It's a really long-winded explanation, but that's like the best way that I can feel to explain it because I'm a very visual person, so hopefully that helps. I'm almost done refining the face so I can start adding in some details like the eyelashes. I honestly don't know why I struggled so much with them here, but sometimes things are just tricky to get looking good from all angles, as well as sticking close to the reference material. But now we're onto the hair. I start just blocking it out really roughly just to get the shape down. I like the method of building up hair with curves, but it can be very fiddly. Especially when going back to edit one point, it will usually bend or twist all the other points and you have to go back and readjust them too. When it came to the ponytail, I used a mesh to build up the base form, and then I just used curves to cover it and make the curly bits sticking out so you didn't see like the base underneath, but it wasn't just so many curves that weren't going to be seen. I've got a few tips when working with curves that I've picked up over time that are actually very helpful. Firstly, when starting to work with curves, you may notice that you can't really scale the points, at least not in the usual way. You use Alt-S to scale points in order to widen or taper them like I have here. You may also find that rotating curves are such a pain in the ass, so instead use Ctrl and T to twist the curve how you need to. It's also really cool to make curly or wavy hair in this way. Aside from those couple of basic transform tips, you can add some variation to the hair strands that they aren't just cylinders. I kept them pretty simple for this model, especially in this blockout stage, but also all of the detail that I will add in is texture based and you'll see that soon. But adding in a curve in the form of a circle and setting that to the geometry data of the hair strands, this circle will now be your new cross section of the hair strands, and you can add in as much or as little detail as you like to add grooves and sticky outy bits, and it just looks really good. Now this hairstyle, and I say this without any negativity to it, but I think I redid it about 4 or 5 different times to get it right. And so I didn't record every single one, and I'm not going to show you every single one here. And like I said, no negativity at all, because my main goal is getting something that the client is happy with and says, yes, this is exactly what I had in mind. It was just something about the main flip of the hairstyle that I just couldn't wrap my head around at first. But on the last redo, even I was like, yes, this is the one, and I can't believe in comparison how terrible the other 4 or 5 attempts were. But they were crucial for me to work it out and understand and just work through all of these different techniques to get to the one that was perfect. I think we have seen enough of this hair though. It's a lot of curves, a lot of refining, but it's just going to be more of that. So I'm going to cut that here and then we're going to move on. I've since added in some rough base colors just to get an idea of how it will all look together. And the hairstyle that you see here isn't even the final one, it's only like the first or second one, but I'm just taking a break, working on something else. It lets my brain kind of reset and then I can just go back to it another time with a fresh mind and then just continue working, and somehow everything's a whole lot better. Now for the part that I was kind of most excited about for this model was the tail and the wings. The tail, shape-wise, is very simple. I use spheres with a little bit of variations, that way it looks a bit more organic. The trickiest part, actually, was the classic scorpion tail part on the end. What I was most excited about with these was adding physics to it at the end, that unfortunately I didn't even get to experience until most of everything is completed, but it is worth it. The wings as well were simple enough and just made up of the individual shapes. I traced over the reference just to get the shape down right, and I added a little bit of variation to them after all the unwrapping and texturing is done, so that they aren't perfectly flat when viewed from the side. On that note, as a rule of thumb, it's best to model things flat without any weird transformations to them, do the unwrapping, the texturing, and then after all the technical stuff is done, then make some organic changes. That's why we model everything in T-pose or even A-pose, it just makes things a lot easier down the track. For most of the clothes, I just select parts of the base mesh in like a rough shape of the clothing piece to extrude out from, and then I make adjustments and refine it to the shape that I want. The corset part was a bit different. I probably could have just done the same method, but at the time I decided to freehand it and add in some more points of the curve, so that way it was a little bit smoother in the end. I am jumping ahead a little bit though. First off, as you can see, I'm working on the choker, which is super simple. Extrude out a loop from the neck and add some spikes. Easy peasy. And because the aforementioned corset took a while and I spent way too long on it, I'm going to skip right ahead past it and onto shoes. They are one of my favorite things to model for some reason. I actually have no idea why, but they're just enjoyable. It's fun working out all the different shapes and the overlapping pieces. My main method to building up the shape is creating an outline of the shape from different angles and then just filling in the gaps. So here I make the shape of the sole of the shoe from the bottom and then built downwards to form the heel and then the actual sole of the shoe. Then looking from the side, I did the outline that goes around the heel and up the back of the ankle. Still working on the heel part of the shoe, I work around the side that goes up past the ankle, and then I can just fill in the gaps between to form around the heel and the ankle. You can't see all of the hand movements and gestures that I'm doing right now, but I swear in my brain I feel like I'm explaining it well. Moving to the front of the shoe and just doing the exact same thing over again. The outline from the side, then outlining the shape coming up from the side and then over the top, and then just filling it all in to fit. And then speeding up past about 2 minutes worth of time-lapse footage. Here's the result of the shoe put together. I posted a quick edit of the process of making these shoes as a YouTube short, and someone did say that they looked like clown shoes, and I can kind of see where they're coming from with the bigger rounded toe on them, but again, I'm sticking to the reference and the design that the client gave me, and it's exactly what they wanted, so I'm happy. Oh my gosh. The jacket for this model was the bane of my existence. I love the design of it, I think it fits the character really well, but it's definitely changed my perspective for future models with similar features. If it were just a jacket on its own, that wouldn't really be a big deal. However, the asymmetrical of the shoulder part just didn't really work out very well. I started out with it mirrored, and then I moved one side off the shoulder once the texture was completed. I'm not sure if it's just a skill issue, but as far as I could see, having the model in T-pose like this just meant that the geometry had to stretch all the way from the side of the chest all the way up to the arm, which left so much room for things to go wrong when deforming with the arm movement. After so much experimenting and trial and error, we settled on a workaround being just a static mesh. So the arm section of the off-shoulder jacket part is in a fixed position beside the chest, and then the client would just have to align their arms into place with VC Face, which is the program that they're using. You won't see that for a while because, as I mentioned before, everything gets modeled and textured first, and then the organic part comes later. But there is actually a lot that went into this shirt in terms of the little details. There's the bow at the front. I say bow, it's just like the little tie part, not really a bow. But I actually put a couple of bones in it with the rigging so that I can add some physics to it. I just thought it would be a nice touch and add a little bit more dynamic movement. There's the shirt collar as well, which I essentially modeled as a separate piece on top just to make things a lot easier for me. And I added in a few bones there as well to the most sticking out parts. I made sure to add some extra detail in the mesh for the folds with the scrunch fabric on the sides. Again, it's just all these small little details which I really pride myself on to really make a difference. I don't know how long I spent on unwrapping, but we are skipping over all of that for the texturing. Now, come to think of it, I actually never looked at how long I spent working on this entire model. I always track my progress on all my projects. It's a program I started using in university because it was required for one of my classes for a semester, but it just stuck and I still do it. It helps me stay on track, at least most of the time, and it's cool looking back sometimes. It also helps with pricing and figuring out how much to charge for my time. So literally right this minute, I'm gonna go and check because I am curious and I don't think I ever actually checked after this model was done. Okay, apparently Past Me was a genius and I split up the tracking in 2 different sections. So I spent a total of 20 hours and 21 minutes on the modeling itself. So that's going to be the modeling, the unwrapping and texturing. Another 9 hours and 48 minutes on the rigging, which I believe would have been the Blender side of rigging and also putting it together and the physics and all of that in Unity after the fact. And then finally, a further 30 minutes on the blend shapes. I know that I only did simple blend shapes and expressions for this model, so that checks out, but I'll talk more about that when I get to that part. So all up, just over 30 hours in total for this model, and now that I'm actually looking at the stats for all of my other models, that's about the average. My Animal Crossing model was 31.5 hours total, my Space Galaxy cat was 28.5 hours, and Jinx was 28 hours. So this part turned into me geeking out about my stats and my time tracking, but I think it's actually really helpful and something that you might consider doing as well. But focusing on the task at hand again, the texturing. It's a big task, going through and adding detail to all of the individual pieces, but I enjoy it. I think because my start as an artist was in traditional and then digital painting, it just comes naturally to me. You'll see me switching between Blender and Clip Studio Paint. I like starting out my process in Blender. It's great seeing what I'm texturing and painting and how it will look on the 3D form as I do it, but sometimes it can be quite limiting. The smudge tool is iffy and the blur can only get me so far. So most of the time, it's just easier for me to export it to Clip Studio and continue working on it there. Blending is so much better and I can still add details if I need to and make the use of layers as well. Of course, you don't have to use Clip Studio Paint or even Photoshop. I used to use Photoshop, but free programs as well are great. GIMP, I used to use that way back in the day. It's not too bad, but Krita is one that I've used more recently. That's quite good. And even Sketchbook, I believe it's called Adobe Sketchbook. I used to use that in university and it's pretty great and now it's free. I'm a really big fan of how the hair turned out. Most of the strands I was able to UV unwrap into straight islands, so I was able to start the texture in Clip Studio Paint by scattering some shades and then adding a motion blur to create the lines and the strands. Some pieces, mainly the big swooping front strand, were a little bit too difficult to unwrap straight, so it was just easier to paint it in from scratch. And even though I did start it in Clip Studio, that was just as a base to add some texture. The real detail I'll add in with the Blender texture paint. I don't have much else to say about the hair, but what I am texturing now is the final version that we landed on in the end. I've got a lot of texturing ahead of me, especially for these front strands that I couldn't put a base texture on, so I'm going to go ahead and skip past that very soon. All of the other strands I add a little bit more texture to, mainly some shading where strands meet and overlap, and amplifying the texture that I already did in Clip Studio Paint just by adding some darker and lighter strands and then some highlights. It's a lot of individual pieces getting their own individual attention to detail, so it's a tedious process, but I love it and I love the finished result because of it. When it comes to clothes, I always try and take a more realistic approach. I've had experience with sewing clothes as a hobby, so I'm familiar with details such as seams are positioned on clothing. Adding in little details like this just really pulls it all together and it breaks up the large blank spaces. It just helps. A lot of people usually ask me how I paint directly on the model, and it's really just as simple as applying a material to the object, for the base color selecting image texture, and then you can either create a new image directly in Blender or apply one that you already have saved. And that's literally it. When you go into texture paint from there, it will paint onto that texture. And then it's really helpful. As you can see, I have an extra little window dragged out from the left. I usually, 99.9% of the time, have this set to the UV editor. It's cut off a bit at the top because my monitor isn't the standard 1920 by 1080, but I can select from all the images currently loaded into Blender. I can open the texture that I'm currently painting on to see it as I work on it. I can even paint directly onto that 2D image, even though I do very rarely do this inside of Blender, but it is an option. And you can see throughout a lot of this video, I also have the character's reference image opened here, which lets me color pick directly from the image. It's also very handy for me to be able to have the reference visible right beside where I'm working, so that way I can just glance over at it, rather than looking at my other monitor and moving my head. And because texture painting is such a big task and I have lots of footage to show for it, let me take a moment to talk about the different painting blend modes. If you are familiar with Photoshop or other similar programs that support layers, you've probably heard of blend modes like multiply, overlay, add, darken, etc, etc. There's heaps of them and they can be really cool ways to add in extra detail and shading, but you can actually use this to an extent in Blender as well. You see, Blender, without the use of special plugins, doesn't support layers. But the brush itself can be set to paint in multiply or overlay or add or any of the other blend modes. I like using these when adding shading because they usually give a nicer and more vibrant look than just the standard colors layered over top. And in the case where you've got a base texture of patterns like the constellations that I've got here, which includes multiple different colors, a multiply color can be really handy in adding in shading to all of the colors without having to change between different shading colors or without looking odd over one color and not the other. A special little detail that my client wanted me to add in was their wedding ring, and being such an important detail to them, I put a lot of detail into it. Could I have added in even more detail? For sure, though I didn't want it to be so incredibly detailed compared to the rest of the model, and I also want the model to be able to run smoothly rather than having lots of geometry in a small detail that isn't seen all that often. And so most of the detail in the ring comes from the texture itself. I actually had to model and texture paint the ring twice because Blender decided to crash on me halfway through, so that was fun, but that means I had more practice and I was better at it the second time round. I'm just going to let the footage roll for a little bit while we appreciate the detail. I'm not a big fan of putting music time lapses in my videos anymore. I just find that they're a little bit awkward sometimes, so I always try and have something to say or something useful to talk about, rather than trying to find music that fits and then having to transition back to talking, so yeah, you're stuck with me and my ramblings for now. The ring, however, was the very last detail that I added in for this model, and so now it's time for the disorientating rigging process. I know that a lot of people don't like rigging, I get it, it is a tedious process to first of all build the rig, but to also later weight paint it. First, I'm just modifying a base rig to fit the new proportions of this model, and then I'm adding in a couple of little extra bits and pieces. These extra pieces for the shirt collar and the tie in the middle are just going to be used for physics bones just to add a little bit of jiggle to them. The wings and tail obviously need their own rig as well. Both are easy enough because the tail is already a segment by design, and each segment gets its own bone, symmetrize it, and then that's all done. The wings are also pretty simple. They don't need anything too fancy as they will just be physics bones as well, so I add in 3 for each finger in the wing. Now the hair is the biggest task here. I have lots of small little strands and I don't necessarily have to have a different bone chain for each one, but I do want a fair bit of flowy and dynamic movement, so I'm adding in a chain for most of them. Any hair strands that don't have their own unique bone chain can just be grouped with the one next to it. It's very important to keep things organized because there are going to be a lot of bones very quickly here. My method is to give each hair strand a number and then a .001 after the first bone in the chain. So for example, ponytail 1.001. This is because Blender will, when you extrude another bone out, use the naming convention of .001, .002, .003, etc, and it will just automatically name each one for you, essentially. When it comes to deciding how many bones to put in each bone chain, I don't want to add in too many that becomes an absolute nightmare, but I need enough though that when they do bend, the transition between each one is nice and smooth. If there isn't enough and the bones are too large, you'll see the point where each one bends. There isn't really a right and a wrong way to do it. You can absolutely go with more than I did, maybe even less. It's more of just, you'll learn when you make it through trial and error. It's also a good idea as well to set up a few keyframe poses to test out your rigging as you go. Usually you'll want to go with extremes, like the arm as far back as is natural, and then like 10 frames later, the arm all the way forwards. That way, when you're weight painting, you can scrub through the timeline to make sure it deforms nicely at all times. It isn't as important for VTubers, like especially the arms, but depending on your model, you may want to use hand tracking with it, in which case the arms will be moving. Despite having like 100 different bones in the hair and it all looking completely overwhelming, the hair is pretty straightforward to rig. I separate out one bone chain to work on at a time into its own separate object, and then from the hair mesh I separate out the corresponding hair strands also into their own separate object. Then when I parent the two separated pieces together, it only adds the weight groups that I need at that time for that strand, as opposed to adding a group for every single hair bone onto that mesh. It makes it easier to work with, and it also eliminates any stray influences from neighboring bones that I don't want on this one. I just go down from the top, assigning the first few loops of vertices to the head bone, and then just selecting the loops that line up with bone number 1, assigning that, and then bone number 2, etc. Then when every bone has been assigned, I do a simple smooth, hide the mesh and the bone chain so it's done and out of the way and I don't have to look at it again for a while. And now it's time to add some expressions using blend shapes. This is one of my favorite parts, mainly because it just adds so much to the character and it really does bring it to life. Now with this character, they will only be having some basic tracking, so I'm doing the simple eyebrow shapes, lip syncing, blinking, and like the pre-made expressions like anger, sorrow, surprise, joy, and fun. There's still quite a decent range of movement and expression that is possible, but just not quite as much as if I were doing the AR kit blend shapes as well, using iPhone motion tracking. I also figured it would be a nice touch to add the ears into the expressions as well, and also with the surprise expression, the pupils will go wide. It's time for the home stretch though, because we are now jumping into Unity to put it all together. Well, it's the home stretch for you maybe, but after this point there was still a few things that I had to go back and change in Blender on the model itself. Things like forgetting about faces being one side, and I may have forgotten to rig the eyes. I was just so excited to put physics onto the eye highlights for some extra detail, and just completely forgot about the eye itself. It's a nice detail that I started doing, and I think I'm going to continue doing on every model in the future. It's an easy fix of course, but whenever you have to go back into Blender to fix some things up here and there, you have to redo the whole importing back to Unity, assigning all the materials, all of the blend shapes and the expressions, adding the spring bones, the colliders, and the rigging stuff. It's just quite tedious and it chews through a heap of time redoing it all. But I got there in the end and the client is super happy with it, so that means I'm happy with it as well. And that leads us to now, and this is what they look like in the end. My favorite thing, one of my favorite things about this model is the little teeth, the fangs. I actually forgot in my original base model, and then after I sent it to them, they reminded me about the fangs, and it was such a good catch because it's just so cute. And then the eye highlights that I was talking about, if I zoom in here, they just got a little bit of jiggle to them, and so that's kind of what I want to try and do. Is I really like the 2D VTuber eye physics to an extent. Sometimes I think they're a little bit over the top, but I'm going to be trying to mimic that and kind of experiment more with 3D VTuber eyes in the future. If you're interested in a commission yourself, the best place is to look at Twitter for the up-to-date info. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.